Thank you, Andrew. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, on this hot and beautiful afternoon. I mean, your commitment to enlightenment actually seems to be great in your commitment to the sunshine, which I say says something about the quality of the crowd. It's my very great pleasure and honour to introduce our next speaker, Professor Roger Scruton. Roger's going to deal with a theme that I think has woven its way through the whole of our deliberations. It really lies at the heart of our concern about the second-person perspective, namely the theme of accountability. Many of you will know Roger, but I bet very few of you know the stunning extent and the depth of his CV. He has specialised in aesthetics, I guess that's what he's best known for, but he's published over 30 books, including Art and Imagination, The Meaning of Conservatism, Sexual Desire, Philosopher on the Beach, Aesthetics and Music, Beauty and Our Church. And he's not yet published, but written a fantastic novel, Notes from Underground, which relates to his time in the Czech Republic, and I'm hoping it gets widely read because it is an extraordinary novel, both politically and as a really first-rate piece of prose. Roger was a lecturer and professor of aesthetics at Birkbeck College from 1971 to 1992, and since 1992 he's held part-time positions at Boston University, the American Enterprise Institute, and the University of St Andrews. He's also a visiting professor of philosophy at Oxford University and a senior fellow of the Ethics and Policy Centre. As I mentioned, he's written novels. He's written two other ones than the one I mentioned. He's written a number of general textbooks on philosophy and culture. I think his introductions to philosophy are fantastic. And by the way, just on the side, he's composed a couple of operas. In addition, I'd like to say he's someone whose views have cost him to some extent, and I think he's one of the few people I do know who has had the courage to stand up for some ideas that have been extraordinarily unpopular. He hasn't yet been obliged to drink hemlock, but it's been a close-run thing. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Professor Roger Scruton.
Thank you very much, Ray, for those very kind remarks, and which I don't deserve. As you see, my primary attachment is to a little farm in Wiltshire, and I'm only an amateur when it comes to the university these days. But I do keep up with my reading, and and in particular with the reading of people like Stephen Darwell, and this has greatly influenced what I'm going to say. So I will put some headings on the board, on the screen, while reading from my text. Okay, so the headings will be slightly obliquely related. The first topic is relationality. And we've encountered at various moments in this conference the idea of the relationality of persons. You are a person by virtue of your capacity for and participation in personal relations. Many people have said that. But what are personal relations? They are the kind of relations that occur only between persons. In other words, which demand personality of the participants. And then arises the worry expressed very clearly in the first of our sessions that we might be going round in a circle. Now, there are virtuous and vicious circles. Vicious circles arise when we try to define one thing in terms of another and then find that we can give no account of the second thing, which does not presuppose a definition of the first. They arise through the interdependence of definitions. Virtuous circles arise when we can give a full description of one thing only by giving a full description of the other, and vice versa. Full descriptions are not definitions, since they are not our point of departure in identifying something, but our point of arrival when we understand it. The resulting circle arises only subsequent to identification in the course of offering a full account of the thing defined. The relationality we are dealing with in the case of persons involves, I believe, a virtuous circularity of that kind. This doesn't mean that it is easy to say what we mean when we describe someone as a person, or that we can easily give an account of personal relations. We are standing here at the centre of an enormous philosophical and psychological conundrum, which results, I believe, from a deep fracture in our worldview, and one that runs through language and runs also through each of us. We identify each other as human beings, members of a certain species, whose individual instances occupy positions in space and time. There should be no more problem about identifying an individual human being than about identifying an individual dog. But we identify ourselves also in another way, as I. Kant said that this distinguishes us from the rest of nature, and he was surely right. I can talk about myself in the first person, and when I do so, I utter propositions that I assert on no basis, and about which, over a vast number of cases, I cannot be wrong. But I can be wholly mistaken about this human being who is doing the speaking, so how can I be sure that I'm talking about it? How do I know, for example, that I am Roger Scruton and not David Cameron suffering from delusions of grandeur? In referring to myself, perhaps, I am referring to something other than the human being that you refer to when you point at me. Maybe I'm doing exactly what I say and referring to a self, an entity of which I'm immediately and incorrigibly aware. Now, credit is due to Wittgenstein for many things, but for none more than his attempt to undermine and dispel the illusion that self-reference and self-knowledge are directed to an entity that is private to the speaker. To cut the story short, there are privileges of first-person knowledge. By speaking in the first person, we can make statements about ourselves, answer questions, engage in reasoning and advice in ways that bypass all the normal methods of discovery. And as a result, we can participate in dialogues founded on the assurance that when you and I both speak sincerely, what we say is trustworthy. This is the heart of the I-you encounter, but it does not imply that that's an encounter between other things than human beings. Boethius, I think this might be a time to move on. Yes, Boethius gave us the medieval conception of the person as an individual substance of a rational nature, and I think Andrew referred to this at the very beginning of our talks. Kant broke away from that conception. For Kant, we are not persons because of our constitution, but because we can be treated in a certain way. Persons exist as ends in themselves, as subjects of the moral law, and as freely choosing beings. We don't know how this is possible, only that it is. The crucial idea for Kant was that of what he called transcendental freedom, the ability to act freely in obedience to the moral law, as a result of which we earn the respect of others and exemplify the peculiar dignity of the human condition. For Kant, we are accountable to the moral law. We act for reasons, and our reasons must conform to a standard whose a priori validity is contained in the very idea of free choice. That standard, the categorical imperative, tells us to measure our motives against a universal law, and in that way to see ourselves as instances of a kind. We judge ourselves by standards that we also apply to others, and the critical comparison is between what I do and what he, she, they, or we do. To act rightly is to do what is universally recommended by reason, and in that sense to make myself acceptable as a he as well as an I. In this view, the I-you relation is of no special significance in the moral life, but simply one precipitate out of it, so to speak. This brings me to the topic of sympathy. There is no denying the beauty and imaginative wholeness of the Kantian vision. I say there's no denying it, but all kinds of Philistines are constantly doing so, obviously. But it has always had a certain difficulty in accounting for the moral motive. How do we bootstrap ourselves up into this condition of impartial reflection so as to conform to the abstract demands of an imperative that makes no reference to our circumstances or to our specific human relations? For this reason, many people have been attracted by Adam Smith's view in the theory of moral sentiments, surely a great work of psychology that is still insufficiently recognized. Smith's view being that the foundation of the moral life lies in sympathy rather than in principle. Smith discusses not only the ways in which we identify with the sufferings of other people, but also the way in which our sympathies vary with the closeness or distance of the relationship, the way in which we react to each other with blame, disapproval, and resentment in all the minute circumstances of social life. Interpersonal emotions like indignation, jealousy, and embarrassment have a central place in Smith's picture, and he is in no doubt that the heart of morality lies in the encounter of one person with another. The only problem is that, unlike Kant, Smith does not have a theory of the person. He does not tell us what, if anything, distinguishes the human condition from the condition of other animals, or why freedom, if it exists, conditions the very structure of our responses to the world. I think that this deficiency infects much recent discussion too. The disputes surrounding the rival claims of theory and simulation theory in the philosophy of mind are conducted almost entirely without reference to the radical divide between persons and other animals, and without recognition of the fact that persons do not relate to each other as other animals do. That is a point that Kant recognized, of course, but with the wrong emphasis. It has received powerful and insightful backing from Stephen Darwell, especially in recent years, and I want in what follows to add a few thoughts to those that Stephen has already made available to us today, and of course through his writings on this topic. So this brings me to the topic of self and other. Kant held that the moral life arises from the subject's self-identification as an I. This idea made a deep impression on his immediate successors, and notably on Fichte and Hegel. But they recognized that my self-identification as an I is in some deep way dependent on my encounter with and identification of others. From their attempts to convey this idea, there arose a long tradition which has seen the relation between self and other as the fundamental challenge to philosophy, replacing in this regard the relation between soul and body. And the relation between self and other was further associated by Hegel, among others, with that between subject and object, between the observing I and the world of his observation. And I'm going to try and summarize the whole of Hegel in 3 sentences now. If I were a pure subject, Hegel argues, existing in a metaphysical void, as Descartes imagined, I should never advance to the point of knowledge, not even knowledge of myself, nor should I be able to aim at a determinate goal. My awareness would remain abstract and empty, an awareness of nothing. But as transcendental subject, I do not merely stand at the edge of my world, I encounter others within that world. I am I to myself only because, and to the extent that, I am you to another. I must therefore be capable of the free dialogue in which I take charge of my presence before the presence of you. That is what it means to understand the first-person case. And it is because I understand the first-person case that I have immediate awareness of my condition. Right, so the position which, for Kant, defines the premise of philosophy and which is presupposed in every argument, itself rests on a presupposition, the presupposition of the other, the one against whom I try myself in contest and in dialogue. I requires you, and the two meet in the world of objects. Right, that suggestion is illustrated by Hegel with a series of parables in the phenomenology of spirit concerning the realization or Entäußerung of the subject in the world of objects. Some of these parables, I'm reluctant to call them arguments, are discussed in the literature of political science, notably that of the master and slave. Many of them convey profound truths about the human condition and about the social nature of the human individual. But what interests me is the idea from which they begin, the idea of the subject. This brings me back to Kant. Kant argues persuasively in the Paralogisms of Pure Reason, that's in the first critique, that we cannot know the subject under the categories of the understanding. That is, we cannot look inwards so as to identify the I as a substance or a bearer of properties or a participant in causal relations or whatever. To identify the subject in that way is to identify it as an object. The subject is a point of view upon the world of objects and not an item within it. And that's what the word transcendental ought to mean. It was Descartes' mistake to look on the subject as a special kind of object, and thereby to attribute to it a substantial and immortal nature of its own. Nevertheless, even if the subject is not a something, it is not a nothing either. To exist as a subject is to exist in another way from ordinary objects. It is to exist on the edge of the world, addressing reality from a point that lies just beyond the horizon and which no one else can occupy. We each address the world from a standpoint in which our thoughts and feelings have a special and privileged place. All that matters to me is present to me in thought, memory, perception, sensation and desire, or can be summoned into the present without any effort of investigation. Moreover, I respond to others as similarly present to themselves, able to answer directly to my inquiries, able to tell me without further inquiry what they think, feel, or intend. Hence we can address each other in the second person, I to you. On these two facts, I maintain, all that is most important in the human condition has been built: responsibility, morality, law, institutions, religion, love, and art. There results from this what I call the overreaching intentionality of interpersonal attitudes. This is not an elegant expression, but it's no worse than the transcendental unity of our perception. What I have in mind is this: in all our responses to each other, whether love or hate, affection or disaffection, approval or disapproval, anger or desire, we look into the other in search of that unattainable horizon from which he addresses us. We are animals, of course, swimming in the currents of causality, who relate to each other in space and time. But in the I to you encounter, we do not see each other in that way. Each human object is also a subject, addressing us in looks, gestures, and words from the transcendental horizon of the I. Our responses to him aim towards that horizon, passing on beyond the body to the being whom it incarnates. It is this feature of our interpersonal responses that gives such compelling force to the myth of the soul, of the true but hidden self that is veiled by the flesh. And because of this, our interpersonal responses develop in a certain way. We see each other as wrapped within them, so to speak, and we hold each other to account for them as though they originated ex nihilo from the unified center of the self. You may say that when we see each other in this way, we are giving credence to a metaphysical doctrine, maybe even a metaphysical myth. But it is not Descartes' doctrine of the soul substance, nor is it obviously a myth. Moreover, a doctrine that is enshrined in our basic human responses, which cannot be eliminated without undermining the I-you relationship on which our first-person understanding depends, cannot be dismissed as a simple error. It has something of the status that Kant attributes to the original unity of consciousness, the status of a presupposition of our thinking, including the thinking that might lead us to cast doubt on it. Indeed, on one understanding of the matter, the adherence to this presupposition and the practice that flows from it is what Kant's transcendental freedom amounts to. This brings me to the topic of I and you. The relation that is critical in this philosophy of the subject is not that of subject to object, of I to it, but that of subject to subject, of I to you. It has been several times touched upon in this conference that there is, at the heart of this relation, a special kind of reciprocity. In addressing you in the second person, I at the same time pick you out as a thing that addresses me in the second person, and who does so only because you identify yourself in the first person. You are you for me only because you are I for yourself, addressing me as another you. This is not like the mutuality of animals. The dog responds to the playfulness of the other dog by playing, and the playing of the one amplifies and feeds upon the playing of the other. But they do not address each other through their play, as we do, with a recognition of what each of them is in the eyes of the other. Now, this thought is best understood through the idea of intention. Elizabeth Anscombe has famously argued that an action is intentional if it admits of the application of a certain sense of the question why. She left it at that point. She never said what the sense was, but you can get it from the context. An intentional action is one concerning which the agent can be called upon to give reasons. This is because intentional actions fall within the sphere of first-person awareness. I know immediately what I am doing and why. so that you have direct access through the question why to my stance towards the world. The first-person privilege becomes the foundation of a second-person awareness. In addressing you, I am summoning your first-person awareness into the sphere of mind, so to speak. This enables me to discard scientific investigation, psychological theorizing, the search for hidden motives, and so on, and to engage with you directly, eye to eye. I can offer you reasons to change your mind, or ask for the reasons that will persuade me to change my own. We stand before each other as in a special way in charge of ourselves, our sincere first-person statements being uniquely authoritative in the revelation of what we think, feel, and do. Hence, the word you does not, as a rule, describe the other, it addresses him. And this is a point that Stephen Darwell has made very clear in his writings. It summons him into your presence, and this summons is paid for by a reciprocal response. You make yourself available to the other in the words that call him to account to you. This would not be possible without the first-person awareness that comes to us with the use of I. But that use would in turn not be possible without the dialogue through which we fit together, I to you, in communities of mutual interest. It's worth pointing out here, just in passing, that an intention is not the same thing as a desire. You can intend to do what you don't want to do and want to do what you don't intend to do. Intending something means being certain that you will do it and being prepared to answer why. Intending is not predicting either. I predict that I shall drink too much at the party tonight, but maybe the gods will favour me and I shall find the strength to go home sober. When making such a prediction, I am seeing myself from outside, as it were, assessing the evidence, extrapolating from past observations and drawing conclusions as I would draw them from observing another. My prediction might turn out to be right or wrong, but it is no more privileged from the point of view of self-knowledge than my predictions about the behaviour of someone else. When I decide to go home sober, I make up my mind, and this means being certain, on no evidence, that that is what I shall do. In such a case, I answer the question why, not by presenting evidence based on past behaviour, but by offering reasons for action. I am taking responsibility for my future, and that means bringing it within the purview of first-person knowledge, becoming certain that that is what I shall do. If I don't, after all, go home sober, this is not because I was mistaken in my former assertion about my future action, but because I changed my mind. So now the topic of accountability. One consequence of those facts, which I've sketched only in outline, of course, is that in the I to you encounter, we become accountable to each other. We act for reasons of which we are aware and which the other can ask us to declare. Trust depends on a truthful answer, and here truthfulness is the guarantee of truth. In other words, we can directly affect what each of us does through our dialogue. This applies to beliefs, thoughts, and feelings too. And from this ability to account to each other, there grows the special kind of relationship of which persons alone are capable. We begin each to take responsibility for what we are, what we do, and what we feel. And by degrees, our mutual responsibility is wound into the bond between us, to the point where we bind ourselves with promises and undertake the manifold obligations and commitments that distinguish human communities from all others that we observe. We generate between us what John Searle has called deontic powers, filling our world with obligations which would not exist but for our capacity to invent, accept, and impose them. Now, it seems to me that if we are to look for the foundation of morality, we should look for it here, not in the categorical imperative of Kant, and certainly not in the utilitarianism of people like Singer and Broome. It's worth just saying something about this. Kant deserves credit for making the first person fundamental to morality. Utilitarianism, by contrast, sees the entire human condition in third-person terms, a system of rational choosers who calculate their duties without reference to the commitments that make them what they are, and who therefore have no real reason to do anything. How refreshing, by contrast, is the sublime vision of Kant. But Kant, it seems to me, did not fully understand the role of the other in defining and creating the experience of freedom. For Kant, we are accountable in the first instance to the moral law. The law binds all of us equally in an imperative that makes no reference to our sympathies and our personal ties. Accountability does not, however, originate there in that impersonal form of dutifulness. It originates here in my personal obligation to you. It is in the I to you encounter that children first understand the demand to tell the truth, to fulfill your promises, and to respect the other. Of course, the categorical imperative is important, but it has been most influential in human affairs in times when people have seen it not as an impartial law of reason, but as the command of God, so that obedience to the imperative becomes another form of personal obligation and a recognition that we are bound in an I to you relation with the supreme you, or rather thou, as the religion insists. I give reasons to you and ask for reasons in return. I explain myself through describing what the world means in my perspective. I am answerable to you for what I say and do, and you likewise to me. It is not that these features of our condition flow from our transcendental freedom, as Kant would put it. They are what freedom consists in. Giving each other reasons, holding each other to account, praising, blaming, and negotiating, working for the other's acceptance, and being in turn influenced to accept. These are all moments in an ongoing dialogue in which each of us aims his attention not to the body of the other, but to the first-person perspective that shines in his face and breathes in his words. To put it in Hegel's way, we are subjects for each other, not objects, and the subject-to-subject encounter is one of mutual recognition in which each acknowledges the other's autonomy and also holds the other responsible for what he is and does. My freedom is not an uncaused eruption into the world of human events. It is a product of my social condition and brings with it the full burden of accountability to the other and the recognition that his voice has just as much authority as mine. I'm going to the topic, moving towards a conclusion now, the topic of recentering. There is an important consequence of this accountability that lies at the heart of human communities, and I want to conclude by examining it. Because we face each other eye to eye and call each other to account for our attitudes, beliefs, and feelings, our entire emotional life is re-centered. It ceases to be attributed to the organism, the it that incarnates us, so to speak, but to the I that speaks and looks from it. By our use of the word I, we create a new center of being. We set the body aside, as it were, replace the organism with the self, and present to others a target of their interest that is reserved and which must be made to sally forth in order to treat with those who address it. That is what I meant when I referred earlier to the overreaching intentionality of interpersonal relations. Others enter into dialogue with this thing called I and see it as standing in its sovereign arena, both part of the physical world and also situated on its very edge. Of course, it is not a thing in any substantial sense, and readers of Wittgenstein and Hacker and such people will be all too familiar with the misleading shadows that are cast here by our grammar. Nevertheless, it is true to say that in a person, desire is re-centered, self-attributed to the I, so as to become part of the interpersonal dialogue. It is transmuted into another state of mind altogether, to become an interpersonal emotion, in which subject and object confront each other, eye to eye. Now, this phenomenon has been often observed, though not necessarily in the terms that I am using. Aristotle's ethics consists largely in an exploration of the ways in which our passions can be both amended by and incorporated into the life of reason. The virtuous person, for Aristotle, stands above his or her passions, so to speak, commanding and confining them, able to make choices for the sake of the higher end, even when subject to the promptings of baser desires. The courageous person is master of his fear, able to silence its claim for his attention, not because he's not afraid, but because even in the midst of mortal danger, he is deciding for himself what to do on the basis of reasons that are his. However, the most eloquent illustration of this recentering process is given by sexual desire. And I shall conclude with some thoughts about sex, since they deal with a matter concerning which we are all now aware of what is at stake when personal accountability is removed from the equation. In describing sexual desire, we are describing John's desire for Mary or Jane's desire for Bill. And the people themselves will not merely describe their desires, but also experience them in that way, as my desire for you. I want you is not a figure of speech, but the true expression of what I feel. And here the pronouns identify that very centre of free and responsible choice, which constitutes the interpersonal reality of each of us. I want you as the free being that you are, and your freedom is wrapped up in the thing I want, the thing that you identify in the first person, when you engage with me eye to eye. In popular culture, love songs are therefore elaborations of the second-person pronoun. You know, all the things you are, to take the very best of them. I've got you under my skin, and so on. And in lyric poetry, the second person is emphasized by using the familiar form. And here is a famous poem, first stanza of a famous poem by Ruckert. Du bist die Ruhe, der Friede mild, die Sehnsucht du, und was sie stillt. That very, you are the calm, the mild peace. You are the longing and what stills it. And it's worth pausing over this poem a minute. It's and reflect on the ineffable stillness it imparted to those simple thoughts by Schubert. And I think I can actually achieve this, thanks to. Let's give it a try. There you go. This is Sylvia Schwartz. Let's see if she comes up. It's only 3 minutes. I'm going a bit louder even. So, I think you'll agree that if that's not the most beautiful song ever written, it's nearly there. That's an incredible expression of the reflection on the second person pronoun. You notice how the three abstract components of erotic love, Ruhe, Friede, and Sehnsucht, are contained within the two little gates of Du that wall it in, so to speak. And Schubert's ineffable way of presenting this as something that's completely full of itself and perfected. So that takes me on back to reality. Kisses and smiles. So sex, so conceived, involves treating the other as a free subject and enjoying the mutual arousal that is possible only through the reciprocal interest in each other as self-conscious and free. The other may refuse to cooperate, may turn away in disgust, may act in ways that elicit shame and humiliation. But cooperation here is not just the offer of a body, it is a meeting of me and you. And I think this is important to recognize, that this transformation of the body through the recentering of the emotion. The erotic kiss is not a matter of lips only, still more are the eyes and the hands involved, and surely Sartre is right to think that in the caress of desire I am, as he puts it, seeking to incarnate the other. In other words, I'm seeking to bring into the flesh that I touch with my hands or lips the thing that Sartre calls freedom, but which I think we'd be wiser to call the first-person perspective. Sartre goes on to argue that sexual desire is inherently paradoxical, since it can succeed in its aim only by possessing another in his freedom. In other words, possessing another's freedom while taking it away. Now, I don't agree with that, though it probably accurately represents Sartre's experience of life. But I do think that the kiss of desire brings into prominence the peculiar ambiguity of the human face, which is both object and subject, flesh and spirit. The lips offered by one lover to another are replete with subjectivity. They are the avatars of I, summoning the consciousness of another in a mutual gift. So they're offered as spirit, but they respond as flesh. Pressed by the lips of the other, they become sensory organs, bringing with them all the fatal entrapment of sexual pleasure, and ready to surrender to a force that breaks into the I from outside. Hence, the kiss is the most important moment of desire, the moment in which soul and body are united, and in which lovers are fully face-to-face, and also totally exposed to one another. The pleasure of the kiss is not a sensory pleasure, it's not a matter of sensations, but of the I to you intentionality and what it means. Hence there can be mistaken kisses and mistaken pleasure in kissing, as was experienced by Lucretia, at least in Benjamin Britten and Ronald Duncan's version of the story, kissing the man she thought to be her husband and whom she discovered to be the rapist Tarquin, though too late to defend herself. Now, the presence of the subject in the face is yet more evident in the eyes, and eyes play their part in both smiles and looks. Animals can look at things, they also look at each other, but they do not look into things. Perhaps the most concentrated of all acts of non-verbal communication between people is that of lovers when they look into each other's eyes. They are not looking at the retina or exploring the eye for its anatomical peculiarities, as an optician might. So what are they looking at or looking for? The answer is surely obvious. Each is looking for and hoping also to be looking at the other as a free subjectivity who is striving to meet him, I to you. Now, our sexual emotions, it seems to me, are founded on individualizing thoughts. It is you whom I want and not the type or pattern. And this individualizing intentionality does not merely stem from the fact that it is persons, in other words, individuals whom we desire. It stems from the fact that the other is desired as an embodied subject and not as a body. And the embodied subject is what we see in the face, and that is the lesson I'm sure that we've all taken from Levinas, who's been often on people's lips during this conference. We can see the point by drawing a contrast between desire and hunger. Suppose that people were the only edible things, and suppose that they felt no pain on being eaten and were reconstituted at once. How many formalities and apologies would now be required in the satisfaction of hunger? People would try to conceal their appetite and learn not to presume upon the consent of those whom they surveyed with famished glances. It would become a crime to partake of a meal without the meal's consent. Maybe marriage would be the best solution. Still, this predicament is nothing like the predicament in which we are placed by desire. It arises from the lack of anything impersonal to eat, but not from the nature of hunger. Hunger is directed towards the other only as object, and any similar object will serve just as well. It does not individualize the object or propose any other union than that required by need. Still less does it require of the object those intellectual, moral, and spiritual virtues that the lover might reasonably demand, and according to the literature of courtly love, must demand in the object of his desire. So when sexual attentions take the form of hunger, they become deeply insulting. And in every form, they compromise not only the person who addresses them, but also the person addressed. Precisely because desire proposes a relation between subjects, it forces both parties to account for themselves. It is an expression of my freedom which seeks out the freedom in you. Hence, modesty and shame are part of the phenomenon, a recognition that the I is on display in the body and its freedom in jeopardy. This we see clearly. I don't know if you do see it clearly. Probably a bit, it needs to be darker, I guess. But you see it clearly anyway in Rembrandt's famous painting of Susanna and the Elders, in which Susanna's body is made to shrink into itself by the prurient eyes that observe her, like the flesh of a mollusk from which the shell has been prized. Unwanted advances are therefore also forbidden by the one to whom they might be addressed, and any transgression is felt as a contamination. That is why rape is so serious a crime. It is an invasion of the victim's freedom and a dragging of the subject into the world of things. And I don't need to emphasize the extent to which our understanding of desire has been influenced and in many ways subverted by the literature from Havelock Ellis through Freud to the Kinsey reports, which has purported to lift the veil from our collective secrets. But it is worth pointing out that if you describe desire in the terms that have become fashionable, as the pursuit of pleasurable sensations in the private parts, then the outrage and pollution of rape become impossible to explain. Rape on this view is every bit as bad as being spat upon, but no worse. In fact, just about everything in human sexual behavior becomes impossible to explain on the current view. Now, rape is not just a matter of unwanted contact. It is an existential assault and an annihilation of the subject. This fact has seldom been more poignantly captured than by Goya in one of his paintings devoted to scenes of brigandage. The girl in this painting, you can just about see her, is being relieved of her clothes by her captors, who handle the precious stuff with a concupiscent delicacy that is all the more excruciating in that we know how they are about to handle her. She hides from them, interestingly, not her body, but her face, the place where her shame is revealed, and by hiding which she does all that she can to withdraw herself from what is about to happen, to make it clear that this is not an I-you encounter in any sense. Sexual desire is inherently compromising, and the choice to express it or to yield to it is an existential choice in which the self is at risk. Not surprisingly, therefore, the sexual act is surrounded by prohibitions. It brings with it such phenomena as shame, guilt, jealousy, as well as joy and happiness. Sex is therefore deeply implicated in the sense of original sin, at least as I would describe it, the sense of being sundered from what we truly are by our fall from the world of subjects into the world of things. So I conclude with just a few remarks about decentering by way of contrast. A few footnotes to that idea. Just as our animal feelings can be and ought to be recentered in the I, so can these same feelings be decentered to become spectacles in the world of the it. That is to say, they can be experienced not as mine and as expressions of what I am, what I feel, and what I choose in relating to you, but as forces that impinge on me from outside, that prowl like vagabond winds in the world of objects, sweeping I and you away together on the crest of their indifference. Inevitably, we have heard a lot about pornography lately, and people are beginning to wake up to the very real threat that it poses to the emotional development of children. There is much talk of the objectification of the other, and of women in particular, and I do not deny that there is truth in these complaints, which have their roots in the same Kantian intuitions that have animated our secular worldview since the Enlightenment. But I think the complaints do not get to the heart of the matter. The real evil of porn lies not in its portrayal of other people as sexual objects, but in the radical decentering that it effects in the sexual feelings of the observer. It prizes sexual excitement free from the I-to-you relation and directs it to a nameless scene of mutual arousal in which arousal too is depersonalized, so as though it were a physical condition and not an incarnation of the self. This decentering of arousal and desire makes them into things that happen to me, occurring under the harsh light of a voyeuristic torch, so to speak, instead of being part of what I am to you and you to me, occurring under the soft light of our mutual accountability. So this decentering of our vital passions is not confined to the sexual sphere, of course. It is, we see it in many cinematic entertainments of our time, nor is the phenomenon entirely new. It is what Marx called fetishization, and what was discerned as such in the art of Hollywood by the mean-minded critics of the Frankfurt School. To some extent, it has to happen, and is not always a catastrophe. But we should recognize that if the feelings that serve above all other to attach us to each other, namely sexual feelings, are decentered, and if children learn these feelings, as they do so often today, from their decentered versions, we are bound to experience a vast change in the nature of human communities and a loss of the tender sentiments on which they depend. So I will stop there with that, just the reference to those two famous words of Flaubert, the éducation sentimentale, which I think, is what all of this way of thinking is really leading to in the end. Thank you.
Do come and sit down. But I think you'll agree that was an absolutely extraordinary talk. I mean, Hegel in 3 lucid sentences. I mean, that is making Hegel lucid is to transduce him to some extent, didn't he? But I just thought it was absolutely brilliant. And poetic as well. I just caught on one particular phrase, the first-person perspective that shines in his face and breathes in his words. This seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, what philosophical discourse should be. It's got definitely tinge with poetry, plenty of passion, and bringing together so many themes. I guess in a musical way that being a musician comes to you naturally. The art of composition being the art of transition.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
So.
Well, we've got time for discussion, so fire away. Yes. Oh, yes, sorry. Please wait for the microphone.
Yeah, okay, sorry. At one point, about the idea of first-person authority, because you said at one point, I know immediately what I am doing and why. Mm. Well, one point you can make in that regard is that what I am doing could fall under multiple descriptions. I sit down to write a letter. What am I doing? I could be trying out my new desk. I could be practicing my handwriting. I could be trying to assuage my loneliness by getting in touch with an old friend, etc., etc., etc. I mean, there are multiple descriptions. So in what sense, there's the plurality of descriptions is already a problem, but also one could make the Freudian point that I maybe unconsciously I know that this old friend doesn't actually want to be in touch with me anymore. So there's a kind of vindictive element in the fact that I'm writing to him. So, but I may not be aware of that. So there's seems to me though those features of action problematize the idea that we have an indefeasible first-person authority. Another situation I would think of is
perhaps that's a very good question.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Roger, would you like to?
Yes, I mean, it is a good question. I would say, first of all, about the possibility of multiple descriptions, that this doesn't in itself defeat the claim that my actions that I do intentionally are known to me under those descriptions. I'm capable of knowing all those descriptions, and normally there's a whole wave of things which I haven't made explicit to myself, but I can under the impact of the question why asked by someone else, and that's part of what is important here. Bringing in Freud, however, of course, does complicate things, and just in what way depends upon what authority you attribute to Freud. I attribute virtually none. but other people think that it's very important. I suppose I'm tempted by the Wittgenstein's view that the criterion of truth of a Freudian analysis is the extent to which it can be brought into the first-person awareness under the pressure of the psychotherapeutic process. But other people would disagree with that. But one thing you could say is that, yeah, there is a whole aspect of ourselves which is part of our motivation but is hidden from us. But that can't actually be part of what we are for each other until brought in to our human relations by some kind of therapeutic process. So in the end, it's the extent to which it can be brought into this thing that I'm describing that makes it real for us.
Well, I think many psychoanalytic theorists would agree with that the ultimate criterion of the validity of the interpretation would be that it is accepted by the analysand as an accurate interpretation.
And that puts the first-person privilege again at the centre of things.
Yeah. The other situation I was thinking of is, say, a situation of a jazz improvisation where suddenly I play a descending whole tone scale. Do I know why I'm doing that? It's a spontaneous act that somehow fits into the pattern of the improvisation, but do I really know why I do it at that moment?
Yes. I mean, you might. Someone might say, "Why do you do this?" You'll have an answer. Mm-hmm. I do this because it fits in. Mm-hmm. Okay. And if you said, "I don't know, it just came over me," that is also a satisfactory answer. Mm-hmm. If the person then responded by saying, "But look, you have to know. It wouldn't be a real improvisation if you didn't know why you were doing it," then I think he would have misunderstood what improvisation is.
I mean, the general point, Roger, I guess, is you don't have to be absolutely transparent, and your actions don't have to be utterly, as it were, riddled with self-awareness.
Yeah.
There'll be aspects of your actions and aspects of your intentions that are not.
Yes.
Transilluminated, as well.
Yeah.
Yes. Ralph. Sorry, Ralph there, and then I'll work my way backwards. Yeah.
Past you. Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to ask about the soul. So you said that we need to have an idea of the transcendental soul, something like what Kant has an idea of, in order to understand our engagement with one another. However, you also said that this wasn't the soul of Descartes, the myth of the ghost in the machine, that kind of a thing. Now, I think in the first critique, Kant seems to imply that the soul of rational psychology, the one we need to understand our normative engagements, really is the soul of Descartes, and we need to think in those terms, regardless of whether it's metaphysically accurate or metaphysically knowable. And one aspect of that, I should think, regarding what you said about sex, is that some of the consolation people find for the humiliations they suffer, and one of the philosophical consolations which has been offered, is in our own otherworldliness. So Ray mentioned drinking hemlock at the beginning, the dialogue of Plato in which that appears. The whole point of it is that this isn't a terrible humiliation or such an awful thing precisely because Socrates considers himself to be something rather like a Cartesian soul. So I just wondered how much do we need to depart from a naturalistic metaphysics in order to understand our normative engagements with one another, and to what degree is it philosophically reasonable to do so?
Well, that's the whole of the philosophy of mind in one question, really, isn't it? I don't want to draw very many metaphysical conclusions. My own view is that what Kant is saying in the first critique is that our position as subjects is defined by a certain kind of epistemological privilege, that we know that we are unified consciousnesses, and this is he describes as the transcendental unity of our perception. But to deduce from that therefore there is some object, some soul, substance, or whatever, of which we have privileged awareness, is an invalid inference and not required by what we know. So I'm trying to say, look, the distinction between subject and object, between self and other, and all these distinctions are necessary to us, but they can be made without any ontological commitments at all.
Do you feel that's satisfactory, Ralph? Are you satisfied?
Absolutely not, but thank you anyway.
Thank you. Yes, I beg your pardon. It's a lady over there in the 5th or 6th row.
Thank you so much for your talk. I actually also had a question about the notion of the soul. I'd like to try to relate what you said here with an essay that you recently published in a collection that was put together by Wenzel van Hoystein on the self. I believe it was called Neuro-Nonsense. And at the very end, you offered a very sort of tentative defense of the notion of the soul. And if I'm recalling it correctly, I believe you turned to the Aristotelian notion of form as a way to hint toward how you might spell that out. And so I wondered if you could relate today's account of subjectivity that you gave us in terms of the first-person awareness that emerges in the midst of IU accountability to the Aristotelian notion of form. Is there a connection there? Do you see a connection there?
This is very depressing because I don't think I agree with what I wrote in that essay on the soul. I'm tempted, and I think many people are tempted by the Aristotelian position of the hylomorphistic position, that in some way the soul should be, or our mental capacities should be understood as organizing the material that constitutes us and so on. And I think that is in general perhaps right, but when we come to talk about the person, we're talking about a specific aspect of the human being, the aspect which is engaged in these IU relations and might not be manifest by all human beings. You know, there are people who don't get to that point. And so I think we have to describe it independently, see what it is independently. And of course, it is not so much a constitution or a form as a status, you know, an ability to engage in certain kinds of relations, which is made possible by capacities that we have.
Just bouncing in that case, Ralph, you'd like to have a second helping, because your question essentially was, how far does one need to depart from metaphysical naturalism in order to be able to capture the kinds of things that Roger felt were central to the I-thou relationship? And that was the burden of your question. Do you want to have another go?
Well, you've had it for him. Why don't I just say a bit more then? If you look at Stephen's writings on this, for instance, there isn't any point, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no point at which you would say, okay, so he's saying that the soul is an independent entity and that the body is one thing, the soul is another. On the contrary, he's saying that we are the kind of thing that enters into certain kind of relations with each other, and as such, see each other in a certain way, and see the other in a certain way. That's right, isn't it? And I'm really taking off from that, and I think this is there in Hegel too, which is why I referred to him, that there are many shadows cast by our language when we talk of ourselves in this way, and one of the shadows is the soul shadow, so to speak, that is walking always behind me. But the philosophical account of what it is to engage in these kind of relations can be carried out without making any such ontological claims. That's what I would say. Of course, it means that we are a very special kind of being, and there is a mystery in the human condition. I think Jerry Valberg, in his book on on self and death and dream, death and self. Yeah. It brings out very well the kind of mysteriousness that comes from this, that we're always looking for each other at a point where we can't be found, so to speak. Not because there is something that could be found in some other dimension, but that's what I call this overreaching intentionality, you know, looking always beyond what is given, but to that shadow.
Steve, would you like to respond to that, or anything you'd like to add to Roger's? We can't end on a note of agreement. This is terrible. Yes, sorry, beg your pardon. Yes.
Thank you. Early on in your talk, when you were talking about the transcendental I, you put up on a slide the phrase, not a something but not a nothing either, which I know you will know is a phrase from the Investigations, not the Tractatus, where Wittgenstein has a transcendental I. Right. Now, my question is not, please compare the later to the early Wittgenstein, but do you see this as an attempt to domesticate, as it were, internalize the transcendental, and yet preserve the sort of power that you think it has in its classic transcendental form? And was the point of your discussing sex that this is an example of such a domestication?
Well, that's a very interesting suggestion. I think that obviously the word transcendental is incredibly controversial. It means lots of different things to different people, and Kant is systematically ambiguous about it. Sometimes he uses the word transcendental to mean that a presupposition of our empirical thinking, so to speak, rather than a world or an object that exists beyond the world of empirical discovery. I suppose I would say, yes, I am trying to domesticate that idea of one of those ideas of the transcendental, saying that there are presuppositions that we make in our relations to each other, which probably cannot be translated out of those relations and put forward as a description of what the world contains. And I think that, and that's why we are inevitably going to be mysterious to each other up to a point. And that mystery is a precious thing. That's what Schubert is expressing in that poem, or in his setting of Ruckert's poem, is precisely that. You know, that the focus on the other you is filling that you with a meaning which can't be translated into anything except this full-hearted recognition of the sort of untouchability of the other.
Roger, you very much focus on a dyadic relationship in the I and the thou, but in real life one has multitudinous, different sorts of relationships.
Yes.
I may relate as a doctor to see 25 patients in a clinic who come to me for entirely instrumental but totally honourable purposes. I may be walking through a crowd and hopefully courteously doing that, and it's a completely different relationship. So in many ways, I guess your dyadic I-thou relation is a kind of asymptote of our human potential, rather than what actually is played out most of our days.
I think it would be better to say that all I've talked about is the general structure. And I've illustrated it through one very difficult and controversial case, which is sex. Yes. The case of doctor and patient is an easy and non-controversial case because accountability is, as it were, built into a system of rules and procedures, and you can remain, as it were, one remove from it. But I think, yes, accountability takes different forms depending upon the nature of the relation and what we hope to achieve through it.
Yeah. Thank you. I think there's a hand at the back. Thank you. Then at the front. So there you are. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question about what you might call progress in this sort of I-thou relation. So when you speak of the subject as standing on the edge of the world, the edge is a place where you're either on it or you're over it or you're not on it. It doesn't really seem to admit of degrees. And yet there's an intuitive sense in which, for instance, in the sexual encounter or in many others, the encounter between the I and the thou makes progress and it grows in closeness. There are different ways to characterize it, but there's a progress. So do you think that this encounter admits of degrees, and if so, what would you identify as the principal means of achieving progress?
Well, I admit that in using the image of the edge, I am using figurative language, and what I mean is that as it were, that's the way we see each other, as somehow looking into the world from a point that is somehow inaccessible to us. Of course, there is the way of building IU relations, making them more rich, getting to know the other more, but that's not, as it were, bringing him forward off that edge or making him topple over into reality. It's rather filling up the foreground with the things that make it worthwhile to relate to him, and that's something that that we know from our own experience and from literature, obviously.
Thank you.
Would you mind passing that?
Following up on your comment about the inherently mysterious nature of the self-other relation, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on various thinkers, poets, theologians, artists, who see divinely revelatory potential within that relation. I'm thinking of Simone Weil, who between the person who's suffering and the person who's having compassion, there's this presence and absence that mirrors the presence and absence of God. Or in John Donne's erotic poetry, the presence and absence of the lover participates in a sacramental way in the presence and absence of God to creation. So is there something theologically significant, do you think, to the mystery of that relation?
Well, I think this is a very important question that it's obvious that from my way of describing the IU relation and the way in which we perceive each other in this, as standing on the edge of the world in which we both are, that that could be accepted by someone who didn't believe in God. Someone like Ray. I think Ray does accept something like that. But at the same time, it opens the way to a vision of what religious experience is, which is very close to Simone Weil. You're absolutely right about that. And also to something that Andrew talked about in the opening talk, when he referred to the act of joint attention, one subject in which is God. That we sometimes have that experience of joint attention without being able to identify who the other is, except in those terms. And perhaps truly saintly people go through life like that, seeing the world with that invisible other who knows it in another way, but joining his attention to that other's attention. And so you can, from this kind of picture, build up a fairly enriched view of what the religious experience is like, even in a world like ours, which seems to contain so many obstacles to it.
Roger, I hope you don't mind if I ask you a slightly broader question, but I enjoy listening to your presentation so much, and all the erudition and all the different themes, the humanity and so on. The way that you talk is not as prevalent as perhaps it should be in the upper echelons of academia. There are many, many academics who are very good at their disciplines, and they have a broad education as well. But it's not quite as common as perhaps what one would like. So if you had a chance to organize a university or a school, may I ask you to just express what would you like to see happen in such institutions? Thank you.
Well, you saw that, conversation is different at Horsell's Farm from the university, and that's where I mostly am. But I think that in the question of organising a university, I think that, of course, conversation is a fundamental part of it. Conversation in the old sense of sitting down together and in a symposium-like way and taking a topic and letting oneself respond to that topic. I think a proper university education therefore should be collegiate, and there should be a sense of belonging to a small community. A modern university is too big to have that sense, but dividing into colleges, as in Oxford, seems to me to be the right way. Obviously, wine is an important part of it. There should be proper meals. These should be the main episodes in the day, and I suspect proper religious services for people who, both of those who believe and those who don't. It's a kind of gentle ritual which unfolds the other dimension of life than the merely utilitarian. And then, I mean, what subject should be taught? I don't know, but I guess what you're worrying about is the way in which humanities have got fragmented into little specialist areas which don't make any contact with each other. And I think that is regrettable. But let's face it, the main authorities about which this question of self and other main authorities who've been invoked, apart from Stephen, have been French. People like Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, I know he's Lithuanian originally, but you know he's part of that whole burgeoning of intellectual life in post-war Paris. Sartre, again. None of these were in a university. They met in cafes, and they got their education from Alexander Kojève, who himself was lecturing in extracurriculum outside his own job as a civil servant. So there was there a sense that intellectual life had to go on outside universities. But you know, we have entered obviously a very difficult phase, partly because there's so many people come to university now who don't know what they come to do, partly because of this specialization, and also career structure and all the rest.
That seems to be an extraordinarily important question, because it seems we have tantalizing arias of real conversations, you know, like the last 3 days and so on, and then it's back to business as usual. And universities have become terribly instrumentalized. The research excellence framework and so on has made it, so I think it's something we need to think about.
But my students always come bearing gifts of claret and so on, and expect to sit around till midnight having real education.
Yeah. So yes, gentleman there who's got the microphone, and then
much easier if I don't have to pass it around.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk about the mystery or the ghostliness of the self. And I wonder sometimes whether things aren't mysterious when they don't have the correct metaphysics underlying them. And it occurs to me that something like a sign is kind of inherently ghostly to some, because once you abstract it from the assigned vehicle and you come to see it as a relation between one's interpretation and the object that it signifies, it is sort of immaterial. And if we are to grasp a sign in any way, it's only going to be intellectually. But once you realize that, then you might as well conclude that the intellect is an organ of sense as much as vision is, and that can collapse some of the mystery. So I thought I'd ask you whether you'd gotten into the ontology of signs, and if you had, whether that was something that you abandoned and didn't think was fruitful.
The ontology of signs. You mean signs which are not just part of language, but as it were, like revelations?
No, I mean signs as, say, triadic relations between interpretants and objects and sign vehicles, and which make up, in theory at least, all of reality, not just the way we experience it.
Well, if I understand you rightly, you're suggesting that there might be ways in which we experience the world as mysterious through seeing things, one thing as a sign of another, but without actually there being any mysterious objects beyond those signs. Is that the idea?
Well, I think things may just not appear as mysterious and as ghostly once it's considered quite normal to think of intellectual experience as real empirical experience of a sort.
Well, certainly, if everybody talked like you, the world would be mysterious.
In a very beneficent way,
yeah.
Yes. I saw some hands. Yes, gentleman there. And then the lady at the back, yes.
Thank you, Professor Scruton. My question was to invoke another French thinker, René Girard, the French anthropologist, and in 3 short sentences, your comments on desire kind of prompted me to think of his account of mimetic desire. So his argument is that we don't just imitate others' behaviours, but also their desires. And so put 2 children in a cot, one desires the ball, the second imitates, and this can kind of spiral into a cycle of violence. And he wants to use this to account for a scapegoating mechanism. I'm wondering what you make of this more pernicious potential in the I-thou relationship if you go along with Girard.
Well, that's a very good question. Obviously, there are 2 ways of reading, well, at least 2 ways of reading Girard. One is that he's really talking about the preconditions of the I-thou relation. You know, that he's talking about human beings, the human beings before properly accountable relations have come between them. That the mimetic desire belongs to that pre-human or pre-personal stage, and it's overcome the conflicts that are generated in that pre-personal stage are overcome through acts of sacrifice and all the rest. And of course, he goes on to draw various Christian conclusions about what happens when the sacrificial victim accepts his lot. That's one way of reading it, what he says, and in that way of reading it, I think there is an element of truth in it. I think there's something deep there, that it is the case that when we emerge into the I-thou relation and all that goes with it, in particular the taking of account, the accepting of responsibility for our own lives and the accounting to others for what we are and do, then there is an instrument of peace which brings these visceral conflicts to an end. But there is another reading which says that this is there all the time in human communities, that there is only mimetic desire, then the sacrificial explosion, and then it all starts again. And I think that we may be moving back in that direction. Yeah, but on the whole, I think that is not true. I mean, we in this room are obviously in a completely post-conflict stage in our development, I would have said.
I suppose there's a pernicious element that's picked up in Spinoza's ethics when he said we desire that which we see others desire. And that's the basis of consumerism and celebrity culture to some extent.
There is that, yes. But we also have it within ourselves to transcend that. And in the true I-thou relation, we transcend it straight away.
Yeah. Thank you. Lady at the back, and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Scruton. My question has to do with an interest I had with your using the second personal connection and then applying it to the paradigm of the sexual encounter, and using that to say that things like pornography or fetishes are detrimental to some true second personal encounter in the sexual act. And that reminds me a lot of some Catholic philosophers like Karol Wojtyła, for instance, who uses a similar idea, the idea of free gift, total gift of self, but actually pushes it even further to say things like contraception even will inhibit this free gift of self, being able to see the other totally as other, to see them as a subject in themselves. And I'm wondering if you think, if you would push it as far as contraception as well, If you don't, why? And if you do, why go that far as well? Thank you.
Wow. Yeah, I understand what John Paul II was saying, but I wouldn't go that far, no. I don't know. I'm not familiar with all the arguments. I have actually read that book that Osobi Chin, or whatever it is, Person and Act, isn't it? And I didn't really find in there an argument that persuaded me that contraception is somehow a depersonalizing factor. I mean, of course, it changes the nature of the act. There's no doubt about that. And it changes it in ways which do curtail the reach of responsibilities involved. There's no doubt about that too. You know, that without contraception and the normal sexual act in a moment of passion has huge responsibilities accumulating beyond it, so to speak, which we have deliberately cut off through contraception. So it doesn't have quite such a traumatic and existential reality to it. But it doesn't follow from that 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 contraceptive sex is in some way impersonal. It is changed. But if you just forget about the sexual act and say, look, suppose we were human beings who, on the whole, were too timid to get that far, but we still kiss each other and smile at each other and hold hands and so on, then what I've said is just as valid about that too. You know, that could be all that sex consisted in. It wouldn't perhaps have the momentous consequences either that it has because of the sexual act, but it would still be something which involves accountability, embarrassment, shame, hesitation, and all the phenomena that I've been referring to. But I agree that the question about contraception and all those questions is not. Those questions are in no way solved by what I've said. But what I have done is just say that that the phenomenon, nevertheless, is this, rather than what people have attempted to think that it is.
Alas, we've reached the end of our time, and it just remains for me to thank Roger for an amazing hour and a half, and it's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.